Hello, everyone. Welcome to our wonderful series of recorded lectures here. This is what we're going to be doing for our lectures for the remainder of the semester while we are all under our kind of self-quarantines here. I hope you're all at home, comfy, safe, and healthy. So this week we're going to look at, it's covered in Chapter 8 of your Anna Monet book and Chapter 5 of your Gould book. We're going to talk a little bit about eugenics and the hereditarian theory of IQ. So without further ado, let's move forward here and make sure to play the recording for each slide. And of course, this all occurs with that immigration policy of 1924 in the dead heart of the eugenics movement, right? Remember, it was started by Francis Galton in the 1860s. 30 countries had their own versions, right? There were organizations of social reform, there were biologists, doctors, and professional experts that all supported this. It was considered politically and scientifically progressive at the time, right, to apply that new science of human genetics to control and engineer population health and fitness, right? And it had an economic rationale as well to reduce the burden of welfare services to increase efficiency, right? So this is kind of the basic rationale behind H.H. Goddard's policy suggestions to the U.S. government, right? He wanted to limit the amount of burden basically by sterilizing those who were considered feeble-minded. The problem with all of that is that, you know, this is a standardized test that they want to apply to a wide range of people with a wide range of educational and cultural backgrounds. So in 1906, Indiana passes our first forced sterilization laws, kind of right in the middle of H.H. Goddard's research, and a lot of states were soon to follow. California to date has the highest number of forced sterilizations, and it was generally done on people in mental health facilities, right? So you can kind of see how Goddard's policy suggestions and how dangerous something like a standardized intelligence test could be. Anyone who made below a certain score could be put into a home and sterilized. For men in general, it was done to decrease mental deficiencies as well as aggressiveness. And for women, sterilization was done to decrease reproductive ability and prevent the passing of, quote, heritable intelligence. Native American women were targeted until the 1980s, and between 1970 and 1980s, the number of sterilizations rose from 200,000 to 700,000. So this is kind of an unheard history of the United States, right? That even after the eugenics movement kind of falls out of vogue, they still had in these states a lot of sterilization policies that were still promoted, still used, and still perpetuated quite far into recent history. If we look at another individual kind of contemporary with H.H. Goddard, we have a guy named Richard M. Yerkes, right? And he administered IQ tests to American soldiers during World War I and provided a giant amount of data. Unfortunately, the testing was flawed in its design, its implementation, and the conclusions that were drawn from the data as well. So, in terms of the conclusions, when we kind of cross Yerkes' test with H.H. Goddard's test, the average mental age of an American adult was about 13 years old, which is a shockingly low number and barely above the level of, or the intelligence level of Goddard's level of moron, right? So the intelligence level of immigrants from different European countries essentially could be ranked, with the highest levels of intelligence being attributed to Northern and Western European countries, right? Of course, after these Army tests, African Americans were at the very bottom of the racial scale of intelligence with an average mental age of 10.41 years, right? But you have to realize that these average ages, or these average mental ages, were based off of tests that were skewed in terms of the questions that they asked, right? Some of the questions that they asked, some individuals in parts of the country had no experience dealing with those products or things that they were trying to get them to identify. So the question here that we have is who really gets to determine what is considered knowledge and what is considered intelligence, right? When we look at the Goddard immigration tests, they were generally given in English. So if the individuals immigrating to the U.S. couldn't speak English, they were already at a disadvantage of failing that test or scoring very lowly, right? We also have some IQ tests asked American specific cultural items or asked about them, like Crisco. If those European immigrants weren't in countries that traded heavily with the United States, they may not have ever seen those products before, right? So the Army tests done by Yerkes and the Ellis Island test done by Goddard were used to pass these draconian immigration laws that restricted Asiatic immigrants and immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe from coming to the United States, right? And it coincided well with the eugenics movement that was occurring simultaneously. One of the kind of fundamental mechanisms to occur out of the eugenics movement and its kind of intersection with social policy in the United States was something called the Eugenics Records Office, right? This is developed by Charles C. Davenport and managed by a gentleman named Harry Laughlin. It was based at a place called Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in Long Island, and it focused on race-based eugenics studies. It was actually closed in 1939, right around the time that eugenics was beginning to fall out of movement. But what it did is it created a model sterilization law template that was later adopted by multiple U.S. states. And in essence, what the goal of the Eugenics Record Office was to send these data gathering packets to schools and to families and collect genetic information and keep those in order to figure out who was better suited to reproduce and who should be sterilized based on intelligence as well as genetics. So to kind of give you an idea of how influential Laughlin and the eugenics movement was in terms of the kind of public thought here, from Laughlin's own words, he says, you have to recognize the fact that although we give opportunities in this country, everybody is not educatable, right? This backwardness is not all due to environment because our field studies show that there is such a thing as bad stock. Family stock should be investigated lest we admit more degenerate blood. So essentially what Laughlin is saying here, or what he's writing to U.S. or what he's saying to the U.S. Congress is that we need to be more firm on genetics, looking at genetics, or we're going to allow more people with, quote, bad genes to come into the country, right? And he says that, basically in his statement, it says everybody is not, we don't have the ability to educate everybody. He's basically stating right there that intelligence itself is exclusively determined by biological factors. If we look at one of the influential court cases to come out at the time of kind of the beginning of sterilization, we have the court case of Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was the first to be sterilized in Virginia. Her mother, Emma, was in an asylum and gave birth at the age of, her mother was in, but she herself gave birth at the age of 17 out of wedlock. Her daughter, or the newly born baby, Vivian, was examined at 7 months for intelligence factors and deemed feeble-minded, right? So, and think about that. What type of intelligence factors are you going to be displaying at 7 months old? So it kind of seems almost incredulous or ridiculous to us nowadays. So essentially, she herself, as well as her child, Carrie Buck and Vivian, were charged with feeble-mindedness, immorality, prostitution, and untruthfulness. So looking at more of Laughlin's kind of policy suggestions, he says that essentially these people belong to the shiftless, ignorant, and worthless class of antisocial whites of the South, right? This is what he was referring to the Buck versus Bell case. He said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, right? And essentially what this did was it paved the way for over 60,000 forced sterilizations across 33 U.S. states in roughly 10 years, mostly on poor women and Native Americans. So if we look at another individual who is actually very influential in informing policy through several states, particularly in California, is a guy named Arthur Jensen. He was a professor of educational psychology at the University of California at Berkeley, and he was known for his work in psychometrics and differential psychology. And really, his big statement on intelligence is that intelligence is a general factor that runs through all types of performance, right? So essentially, what he's saying is that everyone has a base level of intelligence, more particularly based on racial differences. So in 1969, kind of during the civil rights movement and when people of color were starting to gain more political traction in the United States, Jensen comes out with a study that says that there is a substantial difference of around 15 points between the average IQ scores of blacks and whites in America. And that difference is the result of genetics rather than any type of social factors. So since that difference is genetics, it cannot be significantly reduced by programs such as Head Start or other social and educational programs designed to improve the environment or education of black individuals at the given time, right? So essentially what Jensen was arguing to the California state legislature is that these Head Start programs that they were trying to implement in poor neighborhoods to uplift people of low income essentially wouldn't work, right? Because of that big difference in IQ between white and black people as a general factor of intelligence. So in essence, what Jensen was suggesting was that intelligence is highly heritable and not really changeable. And he's saying that Head Start programs and rectifying social inequality will not improve IQ scores, which actually subsequent studies after Head Start programs and subsequent educational psychology studies show that it actually does improve overall intelligence scores depending on which intelligence score or which intelligence test you're using. So Jensen continued to perpetuate studies or produce studies that kind of tried to prove the theoretical rationale behind some of these intelligence theories based on genetics. And in the 1980s, he came out with this notion of the two-level theory of intelligence, right? Genetic differences according to race, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. And what he's saying is that every individual has two levels of intelligence, right? You have a level one ability, which is associative learning. It's your role learning, your ability to have attention and associative skills regarding attention or the retention of attention. And you also have, this counts as your short-term memory as well as a level one ability. Level two abilities is your cognitive learning, right, which is abstract learning and symbolic thought, conceptual learning, language use, and problem solving. So in essence, what he was doing was he was lumping anything that would be taught to somebody as cognitive learning and anything that is untaught or cultural as level one. So basically what this does is it basically, if you hadn't gone through the American educational system and did not be able to use particularly English to problem solve, your cognitive or level two ability would be scored low, right? Your level one ability basically saying that those people of different cultures were essentially of lesser intelligence. There's also another interesting theoretical rationale for hereditability of intelligence that occurs that comes from a guy named Cattell Horn, or two people named Cattell Horn. And it's really interesting. It talks about the theory of fluid versus crystallized intelligence, right? Fluid intelligence says that problem solving in novel situations and abstract reasoning would decrease with age, and crystallized intelligence or knowledge from prior learning, knowledge from prior experience, increases with age. So what they're really saying is they're just denoting a generalized pattern. The problem with this theory is that it's very determinative in terms of problem solving ability, right? Most of what we see is problem solving ability actually increases with age rather than decrease, and abstract reasoning in some individuals can increase with age as well, right? So there's kind of problems in terms of making these broad statements with regard to different types of intelligence. Okay, so what you've might have been noticing at the top of your screen so far, and I haven't mentioned it yet in any of the recordings, is this CTONI-2. This is your current or most kind of accepted alternative to intelligence testing that occurs today. Essentially, when they ran the original study, the data was collected during 2007 and 2008. There was roughly 2,827 participants in 10 states from the U.S. They accommodated a wide range of samples being representative for these various factors here. The problem with this study is that, yes, 2,827 is a very large sample, but when you're talking about something like a test to measure intelligence or measure capability, there's really not going to be a sample size that's going to be large enough to make definitive statements about the capabilities of humans in general. So just be sure to review this list of strengths and weaknesses of this CTONI-2 exam that they use for determining intelligence in people who may have learning disabilities. We're going to talk about in a second who this particular alternative exam is most suited for. So in essence, the CTONI-2 exam is used to assess the general intelligence of individuals with language or physical impairments. So this is not really to be used with people who are severely visually impaired, but it can be used with people who are on the ASD spectrum, as well as people with deafness or learning difficulties like dyslexia. They can be used with non-English speaking people or multilingual people, and they can be used with children who have selective mutism as well. So in essence, what the researchers for the CTONI-2 exam were trying to achieve was a way to kind of negate this lower scoring of individuals with certain physical or auditory impairments on these intelligence tests, right? So the CTONI is essentially an easy to score intelligence test, and it has advantages in terms of minimizing the possible confounding variable effects of verbal and motor competence on intelligence scores, right? Higher cognitive levels are assessed, more relevant, in essence, it's more relevant to academic performance, and it is adequately normed in terms of your statistical validity, right? So its issues with validity and reliability are not severe and still support its measurement of quote-unquote general intelligence. Another interesting test or intelligence test that came out in the 1970s was one developed by a psychologist named Robert Williams called the Bitch test. It's essentially the Black intelligence test of cultural homogeneity, right? In essence, blacks would score higher than whites on this test, and what it did is it sought to use black cultural elements to create intelligence testing based that would kind of even the score between the cultural elements that are used in the normal intelligence testing that African Americans may not be familiar with. Unfortunately, there are several kind of statistical issues or validity issues with the Bitch test. There's no reason, essentially, to accept the claim that this is an actual test of intelligence. There's no validity or no valid evidence, no prediction of any type of performance, right? It does not test reasoning skills at all and may have some value for testing familiarity with African American culture, but not with a general overall assessment of intelligence. At least that is what the criticism has been from other members of the psychological academic community. So in essence, we have another one called the Howard Gardner theory of multiple intelligence. And this is, in essence, what he's saying is there's different levels and types of intelligence, right? But this still falls victim to the same failures of other IQ tests, right? Because it's Howard Gardner that's determining the different levels or the different types of intelligence, right? It's kind of interesting, but it has been used to implement a educational system within a charter school network. So, based on Gardner's research or his scale, you can see that he had a whole host of different types of intelligence, right? There's spatial intelligence, there's naturalist intelligence, right? There's musical intelligence, logical and mathematical intelligence, existential intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, bodily and kinesthetic intelligence, linguistic intelligence, and intrapersonal intelligence, right? So really what Gardner in essence was trying to do is create a system that almost mirrored or reflected the kind of educational policy suggestions that were made by Alfred Binet in his original intelligence quotient testing studies in France. So in essence, what do the differences of these quote-unquote intelligence testing tell us? Well, on average, depending on the test, there is a 15-point difference in scores between people who are white and people who are black. And this can essentially, or once we kind of broaden this out and start incorporating other groups, not just white individuals, not just black individuals, we see that these kind of differences can be entirely explained by access to resources and educational opportunities. In essence, if you refer back to Stephen Jay Gould's example in the chapter on the hereditary theory of intelligence, he says that he uses that stature gap. Remember, even Franz Boas's original study on Ellis Island in terms of American diets and phenotypic differences in immigrants coming in, right? Remember, he found that when the children of those immigrants had been eating American diets, they had American body statures, in essence, right? So that gap was explained, that innate natural biological gap was explained by some environmental factor, right? So like those stature gap, the intelligence quotients or the differences or quote unquote perceived differences in intelligence can be entirely explained by resource distribution and educational opportunities that are afforded to different areas and different groupings within the American population. So if we look at another piece of science to come out a little more recently, and you can't even really call it science, I call it junk science, we have the notion of the bell curve, right, which was developed by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein. And it sought to link intelligence, race, IQ, and heritability, right? And essentially what they were saying is that low IQ leads to bad social outcomes like poverty, crime, and out-of-wedlock births. And that low IQ people who are more often found in non-white than white groups are having more children than high IQ people, and that policy or educational policy should reflect that reality. So in essence, what he is saying is that, well, the idiots are breeding faster than the smart people, so our public policy should reflect that kind of notion. We also have another individual who still espouses kind of the genetic link between genes and intelligence, a gentleman named Philippe Rushton. And coming from his work, he says, but with each passing year and each new study, the evidence for the genetic contribution to individual and group differences becomes more firmly established than ever. Philippe Rushton actually supports the notion that there are such a thing as races and that intelligence is definitively different based on what race you are. So in Rushton's book, Race, Evolution, and Behavior in 1995, he tried to show that East Asians and their descendants average a larger brain size, greater intelligence, more sexual restraint, slower rates of maturation, and greater law abidingness and social organization than Europeans and their descendants, who average higher on these scores than their Africans and their descendants as well. So later on, Rushton kind of came out with this notion of life history theory, which in some sense actually makes some degree of sense on a special level. If you look at the left graphic there, you see the growth curve essentially for R versus K-selected species. Humans are a K-selected species in essence, so we reach carrying capacity when we undulate above and below it, right? R-selected species, on the other hand, those are ones that kind of rapidly breed, go through huge declines, come back up, huge decline. You know, they undulate much more kind of dramatically through carrying capacity. And if you look at the right graphic, that's showing you survivorship curves, right? The blue line corresponding to K-selected species or type 1 survivorships, where you have high initial survivorship, and as you age, your survivorship or your likelihood of dying increases, right? Your survivorhood decreases. With type 3 or those R-selected species, those are ones that have high initial survivorship, but their survivorship likelihood declines very rapidly. They usually have much shorter lifespans. Then you have type 2, which is relatively constant among the, and there's not a whole lot of species that are type 2 survivorship curve. So life history theory, in essence, attempts to answer questions such as the following. Why do we age, right, or senesce? Why do some species reproduce only once while others reproduce repeatedly? Why do some species have many small offspring while others only have a few relatively large ones? Why do some take advantage or take long time to reach reproductive maturity and others only take a short time to reach reproductive maturity? So in essence, although Rushton's work in biology in terms of K versus R selected species was relatively good in noting generalized patterns, his work when it comes to humans is kind of a little shoddy, right? He had shoddy data collection, the approach to collecting data from published scientific literature in support of racial differences. So he actually never even looked at any dissenting opinions from what his original assertion was. He aggregates fraudulent data and paints broad strokes. And essentially what he's doing is just supporting racial notions of hereditarianism, right? What he's saying is that intelligence is hereditary and that hereditary is different because there are such a thing as human races, and races will lead to differences in natural intelligence. So to kind of wrap up here, I want you guys to watch this video that talks a little bit about, it's actually an interview with Philippe Rushton. You'll kind of hear his argument yourself. And what I want you to keep in mind when we talk about kind of intelligence in humans is that, you know, it's really difficult to determine what is considered intelligence and what is not. The example that I like to use is, well, would you consider the ability to write academic papers intelligent, right? I can write, I've been published in a few journals so far, but I can't take apart the motor inside of my car. My mechanic, on the other hand, can. So in certain instances, he's far more intelligent than I am in certain degrees, and in other degrees, I'm more intelligent than he is. So we really need to stop this kind of notion or this seeking to find general or broad patterns in human intelligence, right? We should really go back to Alfred Binet's original assertion that we shouldn't be measuring capabilities. What we should be doing is trying to develop educational systems that are more holistic, that try to develop skills rather than our notions on what's considered intelligent and what's not, right? We should be developing critical thinking skills. We should be developing skills in terms of adaptability. We should be developing skills in terms of goal orientation and the ability to achieve goals, right, and the ability to be motivated and determined, right? So, in essence, in conclusion, there is no reality to this notion that we can rank human intelligence using some sort of test that a couple of guys in a laboratory devise using a few